So, traditionally this does come out of a set of tactical realities within the public sector trying to deal with, truthfully, a big shift in the narrative, right? A shift from this, the public sector contract fights are really about taxpayers versus government bureaucrats. That was obviously the narrative that the right wing and others were trying to tell about our public sector brothers and sisters, and how to shift that to a different narrative about community and workers versus these rich corporations that are actually gutting our public services in order to line their own pockets. Right, so that was a tactical shift dealing with a set of tactical realities in the public sector. I, though, would say that in the private sector, that narrative shift is just as critical, right? And the question in front of us in the private sector is, are unions an elite membership club that protects the narrow interest of 6% of working people in this country? Or are unions actually working people's institutions that directly challenge corporate power, whether that's at the work site, in the home, out in our public communities? And if that is the path we want to go and the flag we want to plant, then bargaining for the common good is an extremely concrete set of tools and lessons that we are all still developing together that show what this means. It doesn't just talk about it, but it shows what those fights actually look like on the ground, which is part of what's so exciting about today's panels, is that we get to really hear from people who are actually doing it and the lessons and the difficult things that they're wrestling with. Christina?
Thanks, Greg. I think one thing I've failed to actually lift up is why community groups would want to do BCG. A lot of times the question is, why would unions want to do BCG? But there's a legitimate question on the community side as well. And it's, there's a reality that when we're looking for people who've got folks that they can move into the streets, who've got some relationship to, elected officials or other power brokers or stakeholders, and who've got dollars, we look at unions. But it's also the reality that Greg lifted up, that sometimes our relationships are not great and they've been pretty transactional. And we've had experiences where we go in together and then the unions get their thing and then they're out and we're left, fighting one another for the scraps that are left on the table. So it's actually really important how we think about the relationship of the folks at the table and how we think about the long-term agenda, what we're aligning around in terms of analysis, and what we're looking towards in terms of structural change are really important elements in setting up what will be the bargaining for the common good table that you all work within. So I want us to both hold in our heads the piece around why it's critical for us to do private sector organizing together, but also what is the right constellation of people that you really can throw down with, and do so in a way that respects everybody's, what they bring to the table, and sort of the important perspectives that they bring, so that we can actually win together. So just to add that piece in, a little bit about how BCG is sort of running. Obviously, there are organizations that are doing BCG work across the country, but BCG is, I want y'all to know, led by an advisory committee of leaders across the country, from labor, racial justice, faith, housing justice, community organizing orientation. So there's a good cross-section of folks who are really thinking about what is the bargaining for the common good stuff that's happening all over the place, and how can we support that work? How can we knit it together so that it's more than the sum of its parts? And the folks on the advisory committee are just like fire, should have been on that list of people who are your movement heroes. And the network is supported by a partnership of 3 organizations: ACRE, Action Center on Race and the Economy, the Rutgers Center for Innovative Worker Organizing, and then the Georgetown Kalmanovitz Institute. Did I say that right? So those 3 organizations are, holding the staff, making sure that the advisory committee is meeting, the executive committee is meeting, and actually supporting every day, finding new folks to bring in, and making sure that this work is going. Okay, that's all of the big picture. What is BCG? What's the moment stuff? But actually, let's talk a little bit about how we got here and why now from a different perspective. So I want to invite Joe McCartin and Sandra to talk to us about how we got here.
Yeah, thank you so much, Christina. I know I have chills already from this conversation. So thanks for grounding us in the importance and urgency of this moment. My name's Sandra. I'm the education director at Bargaining for the Common Good. housed in SeaWo at Rutgers. And it's just so moving to see so many folks on this call. We definitely have our work cut out for us already. But the great thing is that in our social movements, we actually have a really long history of workers, of immigrants, families, unions, community members really coming together to build a shared analysis and strategy and fighting together and actually winning. So, we didn't always call it bargaining for the common good, but social justice unionism is really at the foundation of some key fights, victories throughout working class history in our country. So in a moment, I'm going to hand it over to Joseph McCartin. He's a professor in the Department of History at Georgetown University and also the director of the Kalmanovitz Institute. He's going to kind of walk us through how we got here. But first, we want to get you thinking through a little pop-up quiz. So Lily's going to bring up a poll in just a moment and take a look, answer these questions about BCG history just the best you can. Not, no need to overthink it, not about having the right answer, just take a guess. So you should see a poll come up in just a moment, and we'll give you a minute to fill that out. So the poll should pop up for you. If you're not seeing it, it might be hidden behind windows on your screen. So just take a look. And if you're still not seeing it, then we're going to put the text. We have the text of the quiz in the chat as well. All right. See a couple responses coming in. So we'll just give you a minute. All right, responses are coming in. Again, no need to overthink it. Not about getting the right answer, right? We know that we're not really taught this history, a lot of us throughout our lives. So that's why we like to bring it into these spaces. Right, we'll give it another 30 seconds. Get your responses in. All right, we're going to close it soon, so get your answers submitted. All right, we're going to close the poll and just share the results here. All right, so number one, we asked when the first teachers union formed under the leadership of Margaret Haley in Chicago, their first priority was, if you guessed tax reform, you are right. So this goes back to the late 1800s, early 1900s. Margaret Haley was one of the first vice presidents of the Chicago Teachers Federation. They joined this tax fight to ensure public schools receive fair funding, to keep teachers from having to beg for salary increases and pay security anytime the Board of Education changed their tax and lease policies, which might sound a little bit familiar for what we're seeing today. All right, the second question, we asked what union went on an ambitious strike from 1945 to 46 to demand the company not pass along the cost of increase to consumers by raising prices, which would be super helpful today, right? So if you guessed the United Auto Workers, that is right. So this was the UAW strike at General Motors. They fought for not only 35% raise increase to make up for wartime pay freezes, they also demanded GM not pass along the cost of increases to consumers by raising their car prices. Again, would be very helpful today. And they demanded for GM to open their book. So they fought for a say in how the company ran its business and interacted with consumers, right, as well as workers. And we'll hear from our UAW sister in just a moment as well. And our final question, we asked, what city did social workers go on strike in 1965 to demand a complete overhaul of the city's welfare system? And if you guessed New York City, you were correct. So a lot of public sector workers actually formed unions in the 1960s, specifically to fix the agencies that they worked for. So these AFSCME social workers actually broke the law to go on strike with demands for, the 500,000 people who use their services. So they fought for reforms like basic needs like direct clothing grants for welfare clients, and actually won some of their demands. And that strike led the city to adopt a collective bargaining law the following year. So that was just a quick intro into sort of all the rich history and lessons we can draw from. And I'm going to hand it over to my brother, Joseph McCartan, who's a professor at the Department of History at Georgetown University and the director of the Kalmanovitz Institute. He's going to dig a little bit deeper into all of this.
Thank you so much, Sandra. And what a great idea to do that poll, because I think it showed us one thing is that we know probably less about our own history than sometimes we should. There were a lot of right answers on those quizzes, but a lot of folks who I think did not necessarily know the answer to a lot of the questions that were brought up. So what I want to do here is to touch on those examples that Sandra just mentioned through the quiz and show how they sort of point to where we are today. To give you a little bit of an overview of the origins, development of bargaining for the common good and its application to the private sector. So with that said, what are the origins of bargaining for the common good? In a lot of ways, you could say that this comes out of a very old labor tradition, one that dates back at least, say, to the 19th century, to an organization like the Knights of Labor and to its mixed assemblies, which brought together workers of all kinds in a community, often to organize around community empowerment issues in their time. In a sense, you might say it's a forerunner of what bargaining for the common good is today. You could say that tradition goes all the way up into more recent times, that tradition of trying to align labor and community into things like Jobs with Justice or the Union Cities campaign, which came out of the 80s and 90s. There's a long tradition, in other words, of labor and community trying to work together. What bargaining for the common good does is build on that tradition and modify it and deepen it to face the challenges of the 21st century. And in doing that, what bargaining for the common good is also doing is reviving a broader view of what collective bargaining is and recovering, in a way, the broader way in which in the past labor looked at collective bargaining. As the quiz pointed out, way back in 1900 when Chicago teachers were organizing, they didn't see classroom size as their #1 issue. In fact, it was the need for tax reform. Unless they could improve the city's ability to collect taxes from tax dodging corporations, they knew they couldn't fund Chicago schools. And so they began with a vision that went beyond wages, hours, and working conditions in their thinking. This was also true of the United Auto Workers, the second example in the quiz. When they went on strike in 1945 against General Motors, they demanded that the company open its books to the public, that it raise wages by 30%, because they hadn't been raised at all during wartime inflation, and that the union claimed that if the company did raise wages that much, it would still make a profit, and it challenged the company to prove it wrong by opening its books. And here you see on a picket line, UAW members saying that Hitler burned books, GM hides books. The union was positioning itself in that fight to not only fight for its members, but for those who would buy its automobiles. They didn't want their wage increase to be simply passed along. They thought the company could in fact afford it. They were, in a sense, bargaining for the common good, you could say. And this was also the same for those welfare workers who went on strike in New York City in the mid-60s, as Sandra points out. They knew that their system that they were working in was broken. They didn't just demand wage increases for themselves, they demanded more workers. They demanded a better system. They were fighting for their clients and for the good of the people of New York City when they went on strike. So labor's had a long tradition of making common good kind of demands over time. But what has happened in collective bargaining in both the public and the private sector since, say, the GM strike of the mid 40s, or the public sector strike in New York in the mid 60s, is that those demands became narrowed and focused increasingly on the workplace. In fact, the Taft-Hartley Act helped to bring that about in 1947, right after the GM strike. There would not be such a broad range and broad reaching kind of demand from the UAW in the years after 1945. The same thing happened in the public sector. As Sandra said, the year after this strike in 1965, New York City enacted a collective bargaining law that allowed for bargaining, but one of the things that that law did is it narrowed bargaining and basically said, you can't bargain with us about the programs that you're administering. So over time, what happened is that collective bargaining became narrowed down to the wages, hours, and working conditions that we've known it to be in recent times. Bargaining for the common good is about breaking that open again and recovering that broader view of collective bargaining and recovering really bargaining's democratic potential. And one of the other things to know about our history is that as collective bargaining took shape in the first decades of the 20th century, it was just as common, in fact, even in many cases more common, for labor to refer to what it wanted, not as collective bargaining, but as industrial democracy. And that's in fact how John L. Lewis of the CIO was putting it. As you can see from the titles of these panels in the mid-30s, labor had a broad vision of what it believed bargaining should be, not simply confined to wages, hours, and working conditions, but about democratizing society. So bargaining for the common good is about recovering all of that. And it has grown from activism in recent years that began, I would say, in the public sector, and things like the St. Paul teachers and their efforts in both their 2011 and 2013-14 contract efforts to first bring the public into the bargaining sessions so that parents could be there to support the teachers in their demands, as happened in 2011. And then the union increasingly putting on the table issues that were important to the community. And the St. Paul teachers demanded that, for example, the school district cease doing business with banks that would foreclose on students' families, and in making demands like that on behalf of the community. Chicago teachers did this as well in 2012 when they fought for the schools that Chicago's children deserve and challenged, just as Margaret Haley did, some of the inequities of the financing of Chicago schools. The Fix LA movement brought together public sector workers in LA to challenge the fact that Los Angeles was spending more in the fees it paid to Wall Street firms that marketed its bonds than it was spending in maintaining the streets of the city. So these public sector strikes started to raise up this idea of, again, making community demands, common good demands central. And it was out of that energy that we had a conference in 2014 that brought together a lot of these creative thinkers around what is this that we're trying to build, and adopting this term, bargaining for the common good, and then seeing how, in fact, more and more this term could reach out and build new kinds of power for workers. As Greg and Christine were noting, that this approach builds power by broadening the number of participants in bargaining, by opening the processes of bargaining, and by broadening its goals and purposes. And in recent years, we've started to see this same energy spreading into the private sector. And that's what we're here to talk about today. How in the midst of the crisis of bargaining in the private sector, where density is now below 10%, that unions are beginning to realize that real power can come from joining with community allies and incorporating them in the bargaining process. And so we're going to hear about how this is being done in lots of creative ways in recent efforts. Why is this right for this moment? You know, I don't need to tell any of you folks here that our system of labor relations is deeply broken. We see inequality surging. We see democracy threatened at this moment. The very survival of the planet is threatened. Fighting for the common good has never been more necessary, and BCG gives us a tool that can help us resist all of these trends and push back against them. And as Greg said earlier, the most important reason why we're here to talk about this is that we know that when we fight this way, we win. And so let's give you a sense of how we got to this point, how the union struggle has increasingly pointed in the direction of common good, how community allies have seen the need to join with unions in this. And with that, I'll turn it back to Greg and Christina.
Thank you, Joseph. Thank you, Sandra. I think that was really important for people to remember that, in fact, bargaining used to be a much broader set of issues that people were fighting for, and that it's, you know, shrunken down, and it's time for us to expand it again. Really appreciate that. We want to give you all a little bit of a sort of a why now perspective from a really fantastic woman, Cindy Estrada, who's the vice president of the UAW and also on the advisory committee of Bargaining for the Common Good. Cindy?
Thank you. So I wanted to talk just for the next 10 minutes, and if I go over 10, you guys can start waving your hands. But just how we're trying to incorporate bargaining for the common good into our organizing campaigns. And so I just want to take a second to sort of define the moment that the UAW is in around auto manufacturing. I mean, we are facing the biggest transition that we're going to see in our lifetime from electric, you know, from gas-powered engines to electric vehicles. And it's something that, of course, scares our members tremendously, because we know that building an electric vehicle, it takes, some say as much as 30% of our workforce could be wiped out. And so we've spent a lot of time really talking to our members over the last 6 years about what this transition means, also talking about, you know, climate change and you know, again, our members reflect society. So they're just as a myth, you know, is that our members don't care about the climate, but they do, right? And so we've spent a lot of time, how do we be a part of this transition to make sure that it happens in a way that protects the workers in the plants and the communities that they live in. And so where we're at right now in auto, a lot of people don't know this, we have 3 organized companies, Ford, GM, and Chrysler, now called Stellantis, to 11 non-union car companies. So where we used to set the standard in wages and in a lot of areas, that is being very hard to maintain. When you have 11 non-union companies to 3, you know sort of what that means in terms of power at the table. We also have 25 battery plants that are coming online. They're on the map, you know, between 23, 24, and 25, which is going to be our future engine plants. And then you also see this shift in all this work more to the south. This shift was happening before with just auto assembly and part suppliers. But you really see this, you know, strategic shift to the south. One is because they know that it's much harder to organize in the south. Also, you know, and we know that this shift is an opportunity for corporate America to try and drive down wages, try and drive down organizing. And for us, it's very frightening because it also is about racial justice. 40% of the workers that are going to be in manufacturing in the South are Black and brown workers. And we see what happened during the auto crisis when our plants closed. It impacted Black and brown workers more than anyone else. We also see these huge amount of subsidies coming online. Our money, our public dollars paying to set these companies up. So, and a myth by many out there that if they just say a manufacturing job, you know, is going to rebuild the middle class. And we know that that's just absolutely not true. Absent a union, manufacturing jobs are really not really good jobs. Workers are often, you know, in the part sector and walking into work and then walking into a food stamp line after work. So we want to dispel that myth, but we also see tons of opportunities in this moment. Our workers get it. Our workers understand that this transition is happening. How can they be at the table? They understand that climate change is real. You know, the opportunity of the climate activism right now, both, you know, in our country, the discussion that we're having around race and class. We also have workers who are angrier than they've ever been, where they're living in a moment coming out of COVID where 10 people took their wealth from 700 billion to 1.7 trillion. And now talking about it has to be on the back of workers, you know, and raising the interest rates and inflation. So we have the most pro-union administration. So there's a lot of stuff happening that is exciting and very scary in this moment, but a lot of excitement happening amongst workers. And in the past, we looked at it very differently. We were focused on NLRB campaigns. It's sort of, let's go after one of these companies, say Volkswagen. You know, it was about the workers in the four walls having an election. We did have community allies, but it was on a more transactional sort of support letters. It wasn't really grounded in strategizing and working together at the level that we're talking about at Bargaining for the Common Good. And the other thing we had was, you know, sometimes like Volkswagen, they would claim that they're neutral in an organizing campaign, the company, but it was because they knew that the whole state infrastructure going to run that campaign for them. So for example, in Volkswagen, the company said nothing, but the state politicians threatened that they wouldn't get subsidies, which meant that they wouldn't get product, which means their plant would close. And so there was a lot of anti-union forces at work. And we stepped back and really thought about, you know, we're not powerful enough to win 11 campaigns. This myth that if we organize one, the rest will come tumbling down just isn't true, not in this climate, not in the way that the NLRB is set up. And so we started thinking about bargaining for the common good and looking at, you know, what do we do in this moment? How do we have a deeper analysis that it was about workers organizing, but also how do we work with community groups to make sure that we are moving, you know, if subsidies are coming into you know, states, how do we work together with community groups to make sure that we're driving a community benefits program? How do we learn what the issues are that community groups, because it wasn't when we win, we want to make sure that we're also changing, you know, the politics in the state, you know, so that workers end up with healthcare in the South, so that, you know, housing can be addressed. So that all the stuff that we used to do as a union, a labor movement, as you heard a few minutes ago. And so, so it wasn't just about, you know, changing wages and working conditions in the plant, but we want to go further when they win and work together and helping them, you know, build a union. And so one of the things we looked at in bargaining for the common good is there's 3 buckets in this transition. And the 3 buckets are, you know, we're going to work together with climate activists, racial justice groups, and the union to demand that as these companies come in and say that they want to be green, that then they have to have 3 buckets. They have to have emission, you know, to lower their emissions. We have to address climate. We have to make sure that there's democracy in the workplace, a real process for workers to form unions outside of the NLRB, which is broken right now. And then also, you know, we need to make sure that we're looking at the racial justice components, not just in the plants, but outside in the communities too. And so we've started working with climate activists, racial justice groups, and to start to have this discussion and a deeper analysis of what it means to form a union beyond just, you know, the contract. And so we know that it's the combined power of all of us. There's a moment where the beauty to being small is everybody gets that we have to be together. It's not an either or proposition. It's not climate or workers, right? It needs to be, we can do both. That's their campaign. We need to stop that by working together and building out an analysis that goes deeper. And so what we've done in the UAW is we just kicked off about a month ago, our first ever industry-wide committee. So we took these 11 plants and we set up, we met in Birmingham, Alabama. We brought 10 of the 11 were their representative, and the workers started to think about, with community groups in the room, of how they start to build out an industry-wide committee and go for an industry-wide campaign and change the sectoral wages, you know, around manufacturing. And so they're meeting now and also looking at creative ways to do this instead of the NLRB. Are there way we formed our union in the UAW not by going through an NLRB, it was by striking. It was by, you know, getting community support, worker support and striking and making it about more than just that plant. And so we're working together and doing that. And some of the other ways that we started to use bargaining for the common good is, for example, Oshkosh. Some of you on the call may have heard of this. The Postal Service is electrifying their fleet. And so we have one UAW plant in Wisconsin that bid on that work and actually won the work. The company actually used the record of these workers and building a quality product and being so productive to win the work from the Postal Service. As soon as the work was granted, they were announcing that they weren't going to give it to the plant. There's only one Oshkosh plant. They were going to send it to non-union South Carolina. And so we've been working together with environmental activists, with Sierra Club, a number of groups to really push back on that this isn't building back better. Building back better means that workers, community, and climate are addressed. And anything less than those three buckets is not acceptable, and it's not a just transition. So that's one way that we're working together on a campaign through litigation, but also through actions with the members. The members are very much involved in this. You have defense work members who accept that they know that there's going to be this transition. They just want to make sure that they work together and it's done in a fair way that addresses those three buckets. We also are working together. Our president of the union, Ray Curry, joined with Randy Weingarten from the AFT on the electrification of the bus fleet. And so we're working together with climate groups who are demanding from Lion Bus, for example, that you can't call yourself a green company unless you're allowing democracy to happen in the workplace and addressing the emissions that are affecting our kids, whether it be through high rates of asthma, mostly in Black and brown communities. We're working together with progressive school boards right now in Chicago and going to do throughout the country, so that we're working with community to demand that when you electrify this bus fleet, it needs, we need to do it quickly for the sake of our children and those breathing those emissions, but it also has to be done where workers have a fair process. And so those are just some of the ways in which we're trying to bring together, climate activists, community groups, racial justice groups, to plan out a campaign so that we win, not just for the workers in the plants, but for our community at large, and continue to organize after these campaigns. So I think I covered everything. 10 minutes? I think I did it.
Fantastic work, Cindy. It's a Herculean job actually getting all of that in a short amount of time. And thinking about those campaigns and how you're describing them is super inspiring. And what you described actually lays out these 5 key elements of the Bargaining for the Common Good campaign that I want to make sure that we flashed this on the screen and didn't go over. So I want to make sure that I pull them out. Between myself, Cindy, Sandra, Greg, Joe, you've heard all of these things lifted up. There are 5 key elements. And I just want to point out, it is no mistake that the first key element here is centering racial justice in your demands. Critical. This is not the kind of work that you can do if we're not going to be real about the intersections between race and economics. So that's number 1. Number 2 is expand the scope of bargaining beyond wages and benefits. We've heard a lot about that, the history of that, the reality now of that, and what we could be looking at in the future. Number 3 is engaging community allies and unions as partners in issue development and at the bargaining table. Number 4 is strengthening internal organizing, your membership and your member engagement. If your campaign is not doing that, then we are not actually organizing and building power. That's key and critical. And then number 5 is exposing bad actors, which in some ways for me is duh, but there are lots of ways that people win without doing that. So those are 5 key elements to think about in a Bargaining for the Common Good campaign, and that I want you to hold in your mind as we go into this breakout groups. So for the next, let's call it 15-ish minutes, it might be a little shorter, we're going to put you in groups, and we have a couple of questions that we want you to think about. Before you get into the questions, please identify someone in the group who can take notes and who can do report outs. We're not going to do a full report out, but we'll ask a few folks to, what really popped. Here are the questions. What are the opportunities and challenges for applying a BCG approach in the private sector broadly? 2, how does that fit into your industry? And 3, what ideas does it stimulate for you? So really starting to think a little bit about, what could be possible in your work. And you'll have 15 minutes to talk it through in your groups.
All right, hey folks, So hopefully everybody had some good discussion in the small groups. You know, we've got so many people that are both new to this line of strategy on this call today, and also so many folks who have been doing incredible cutting edge work on this. So hopefully folks got a little mix of that in the small groups. And in a few minutes, we'll be able to hear from some experienced campaigners who have really been wrestling with this bargaining for the common good strategy on the ground and what that actually looks like. So before we go to the panel, though, we wanted to hear a little bit from the small groups. Number one, just want to make sure that in the Google Doc that folks who are note takers in each of those small groups, that they download some of the interesting discussion questions, you know, and just notes from those groups, because we don't want to lose that. So if you can please, if you are a note taker, make sure that you get that into the Google Doc, which Patricia just reposted. But for the rest of us, we've got a few minutes now to just surface some of what you're thinking. You know, what is this bringing up for you as you think about bargaining for the common good? What are the opportunities and challenges as we apply this kind of strategy to the private sector? And you know, how is this making you think about your industry? So if a couple of folks want to just be spokespeople or share what's on your mind, raise your hand and we will take you off mute. You can also feel free to dump in any thoughts you have into the chat as well. Let's start with our brother from Liuna, Local 79, Tafara.
Hi, everybody, and thank you for hosting this event and having me here. So my name is Tafadar. I'm from Laborers Local 79. Our international is the Laborers International Union of North America. And in my group, I got to hear from some CWA folks who were talking about, broadband access and how that intersects with redlining and communities of color and working class communities, as well as, organizing newsroom workers. I can't speak too much to that, so I'll just jump directly into, my own neck of the woods. I'm a construction worker from New York City. I work as an organizer for my union. And, the analysis that I had that I was talking about, I guess I've been on my own organically trying to develop a BCG framework since I came into the trades, because I come from the community organizing world. Since I was a high school student fighting against school closures, I actually did the School of Unity and Liberation program right after I graduated high school in California. And, from what I've been able to see by looking at history and connecting that to the problems that trades workers in New York City and our communities are facing now, is basically since the dismantling of the New Deal throughout the 50s, the 60s, and the 70s, we've entered into a paradigm where neoliberalism has, used development to drive down and destroy construction workers' wages and benefits in this city, and use that to plow through communities with development projects that are, geared towards Wall Street investment firms' portfolios, while sometimes masquerading as being about social need. Like right now you have affordable housing that's going up, but a lot of the times it's built, most of the time, almost 100% of the time, affordable housing is built in this city with near slave labor of non-union construction workers. And it's in a supreme irony, affordable housing being used to gentrify working class neighborhoods. So a lot of the times, there will be this bad scenario where community and labor organizations and unions will be on different sides of the battle line because of, the divisiveness of a framework that pits jobs against, rent or community interests around rents and housing. And I think the last thing that I was saying in my group right before I got cut off from time is that the root of the problem is that the private sector and, with the industrial capital in the private sector and the financial capital from Wall Street and other firms, they dominate the ability to produce housing and to produce the projects that we need to meet the need for housing in a city as large as New York. And so the BCG framework that I've been trying to think through, and along with other progressive organizers in the trades, is how do we bring nonprofit community organizations and unions, worker centers and labor organizations together at the same table so that we could potentially build up our own, using city resources or state resources or whatever else, our own capacity to really build affordable housing with union labor and house our people and put our people to work and truly rebuild an economy, a public sector regime of production that really reinvests in the people instead of just reinvesting in Wall Street. I'll just
Great.
leave it at that because I could go on for days, but I hope that was
Yep.
helpful.
Wonderful. And that exact strategy shift from how do we disrupt the jobs versus rent narratives that have been completely dividing us against ourselves for so long and have big visionary demands that can bring those different groups together. That is great, brother. That is right at the core of what we want to be wrestling with. Let's
Thank
go to Lisa. Sister Lisa.
Hi there. So in our group, we had some good discussion, and there were two examples that kind of rose to the surface. We have a group with that represents members at the Mac assembly plant. And so that plant has created air quality issues that not only just will affect the workers, but also has spread out into the community and created increasing problems with asthma and other respiratory issues. And so the challenge is that the workers sometimes at these plants come and go. They're not necessarily long-term, but those living in the community are. And it's about them trying to put together a campaign where they're at a presentation where they pull in the community to get interest about, raising this issue about the health awareness and how they're being affected. The other was good about rent. They have a group that they're organizing that tenants in California are now able to negotiate with their landlord. And so there's a big real estate group that is the landlord for 300 plus buildings. And right now they're trying to get participants, tenants to sign petitions so that they can recognize their buildings as union. And so they can negotiate with this landlord. The landlord, the challenges they're facing is calling tenants directly who have signed this petition, verifying that it's their signature, also giving them options to opt out, and then trying to put on other measures to limit them from timeframes of when they can talk to these tenants. So it's slowing the campaign down. That's the challenge they have, that it's slowing the campaign down. So those were just two good examples.
Great, Lisa. Thank you so much. I feel like both of these examples that folks are talking about really now dive us into the next part of the conversation, which is, so once we have the political will to do this kind of work, right? Once we are looking for this kind of a shift, how do you actually do it, right? How do you actually link together the different interests? How do you actually put the pieces together? And for that, we have a panel that I'm going to pass over to Stephen Lerner, of some folks on the ground who are actually doing this. So Ben, Lou, Emily, many others, I saw your hands up, and we'll have a chance to have some more feedback and some more examples with the full group a little bit later in the program. So please, keep your comments. We still want to hear them. With that, I want to pass it over to Stephen.
Hi, everybody. I have to say, I've been working in bargaining for Common Good for a long time, and this is just a fantastic group, and people are really digging deep, and it's really wonderful. What we're going to do now is, we've talked about this being a strategy session. We don't have the answers. We have some ideas, and we're talking about how we all work together to figure this out. So we have 4 different campaigns we're going to talk about. And these 4 campaigns, in many ways, each one touches on the elements that we've talked about, which is centering racial justice, expanding the scope of bargaining, engaging community allies, strengthening internal organizing, and exposing bad apples. Bad actors, bad apples too, we should expose. But what we want to try to do here is, we've got 4 campaigns we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about how in Minneapolis, they went on a strike, the janitors local, with partners in the climate movement around greenhouse gas emissions in office buildings. We're going to hear about 1199 and the Recovery for All campaign in Connecticut that just won incredible economic and racial justice victories while figuring out how to balance public bargaining and private bargaining. We've already heard some discussion about what CWA is doing on broadband, and then we're going to also talk about what's happening in the news industry with the hedge fund buy-up. And I just did that summary because you see that each one of these touches on something here. But what we're going to do here, is I'm going to ask a couple questions of each campaign, and we're going to try to go through, and then we're going to move to the next campaign, and then we'll all ask each other questions. But let me Let me start off with, if we could bring up the folks from Minnesota. We have Brahim Cohn, who's the and I apologize if I mispronounce anybody's names. You can correct me when you come on. We have Brahim Cohn, who's the secretary treasurer, and we have of the local, and we have Nazir Khan, who's a community organizer and at the environmental justice table. And just to start us off, Brahim, why don't you tell us a little bit, how in the world did the janitors local ended up, and how did your members feel about making demands around excuse me, greenhouse gas emissions, and how did that play out about why this was a workers' issue? Can you just take us through a little bit of that, wherever you are?
Good afternoon. My name is Brahim Kone. I am the Secretary of Treasury of SEIU Local 26. It is a pleasure to be here and be on this panel. For so many years in Local 26, we understand the importance of working with community partners, with allies, and also educating our members in the importance of issues that are not in the contract. Most contract and most negotiation, for union tend to be around demands that we have in our contract. And one thing that we don't connect is what others are doing around us. And there's a lot of similarities, and the fight that each organizations are doing. So early on, we're trying to educate our members on that. Like most of our members are brown and Black and mainly immigrant. We did a survey to see how these folks are impacted by, the climate change, and come to find out 40% of our membership, immigrants, left their country for better opportunities because of the climate change that they have been affected by. And also come to find out that the building that our members are cleaning or securing every day are some of the buildings who are the biggest greenhouse polluter in the city. So that being said, we always want to look around us and see, are we the only one who having issues with these companies who are doing this in the city? But in the research, we found that there are a lot of organizations here in Minnesota, like 350 and other organizations who are taking on this fight. So we try to connect all that and also bring them to our bargaining table to kind of show that there are some connection here in the fight for climate change. They are fighting these big companies. We know that we cannot fighting alone. So adding them to our fight and anybody else fighting for climate justice are welcome. So we brought them to our bargaining table so they can see what we are asking for. And at that time, we were asking basically for clean chemicals, because the chemicals that our members were using are very toxic, not only for them, for the environment as well. And also asking for some money to kind of promote green cleaning agenda. So that was not a bargaining table, but we never made a connection that these are the same people that other organizations also are going after. So once we did that and kind of show the interest that they are after and the interest we are after, and connect both and trying to pressure these big corporations, it led us to set up a strike that was a mixture of our community and the Local 26 members. It was about 50% of the people on strike was the people fighting for climate justice here in Minnesota and our members. And one thing that I want to be clear about, so when you put this demand on the table, you need to be ready to strike, because that's the only way that you can get what you need. And the big corporations are organizing every day. So take every bargaining as if you're gonna go on strike the next day, and create pressure in every way that you can, so this corporation can listen. And that led us to a strike. And I'm glad to say that we want right now a green cleaning program for the first time that we're about to start in, a month or so, to get that up and running. We also want the company to cough up some money to put in a pot to push for the green cleaning program that we are doing. So, and that being said, only if we come together as a community and allies, a lot of these things can happen.
So what's amazing about what you all did there is some people, we can have a debate at another time, have said this was the first climate strike of workers. But what was fantastic about what they did, and I want to bring up that number, he said 40% of their immigrant members said they had to leave their home country because climate change was so bad that they couldn't continue to live there. But I want to ask, and I'm going to ask people to be a little quick so we can get through this. But I wanted to ask Nazir, like, how did this feel to you? Why did you get involved? What was it like to be at the union bargaining table? How did your members react to being intimately involved in both the labor and environmental struggle?
Yes, thanks for having me. I was an organizer with SEIU for a few years, and we formed the Minnesota Environmental Justice Table partly with an analysis of some critique of how the environmental movement is operating. And I definitely came in with lessons from the labor movement that I wanted to bring to the environmental movement. So things like the power of mass organization versus, advocacy and lobbying, like a primary kind of focus on those things, rooting in human impacts and self-interest. So one of the things that drew us in was that these downtown office buildings, not only are they contributing to the majority of greenhouse gas emissions in Minnesota, they also send all of their trash to an incinerator, a trash burner in North Minneapolis, which is a community that has the highest asthma rate, the highest asthma hospitalization rate in the state, an environmental justice community. It's a place where Minnesota, the Twin Cities, has segregated over decades their African-American population. And so, it was in like a pretty serious environmental justice issue. And we knew that, these 26's janitors had a role to play in that because they're the ones who manage the waste, right? And also this waste, these incinerators produce a lot of greenhouse gas emissions as well. So it's also a climate issue. So there is self-interest. And then there are also 26 members, as well as many of our base, who live on the north side. So they're not only like having to handle the waste, I think also, I'm not sure if it's been mentioned yet, but dealing with toxic chemicals when they clean. So they have their own kind of safety issues, but also they're then going home and breathing that air in, right? So they have a self-interest in this. So there was something I think we are very interested in is rooting in like how are people impacted by this climate crisis, especially as it accelerates and it's showing up even in the Midwest, in Minnesota. And then the other aspect of it is, I would say like broadly solidarity. Like I think something you see in the labor movement is class solidarity, solidarity across unions. Like when we had our teachers in Minneapolis go on strike, and you saw nurses out on the picket lines, you saw unions show up for each other in a way that like in the environmental movement is often lacking. There are definitely exceptions, but we will be fighting the same entity, like the Pollution Control Agency, sometimes the same corporation. And different campaigns are not even talking to each other. And so I think that lesson of working together, and this, I think there is history here. We have a beautiful thing in the Twin Cities, I think, of organizations, movements working together. We have this thing called the Week of Action that folks have been doing for years now, in which organizations show up for each other's fights during this one intensive week. And so this strike happened during that week. And so, organizations like housing justice, labor, workers' rights, environmental, all were showing up for each other at their different actions. So there's also kind of a mechanism that we've developed here. But yeah, I think.
Let me jump in just because of time, but I think just if you heard, first of all, just amazing work. But you did all, it was about racial justice, it was about community groups, it was about joint. It wasn't, oh, the environmental movement should help out janitors because janitors aren't paid decently. And it wasn't that janitors saying we care about the environment. We have the same enemy. We're exposing the bad actors. So we're going to come back to this in a further discussion. I want to jump to Connecticut, and everybody excuse me if I'm interrupt a little bit because we have time issues. But Connecticut, for a long time, has had, they were coming up for their bargaining. They have both an agreement for state healthcare employees, then they have nursing homes that are private but heavily state funded, group home care, and then group homes and home care. And 1199 took a different approach. It was during the middle of the pandemic when many people were afraid to sort of come out of their houses. And so without me giving it all away, I'd love for Rob Burrell to talk a little bit about, as a president of 1199 New England, why they had a different approach, what they won, and why it was, how bargaining for common good played in. And then, are you Pastor Rodney or Reverend Rodney? I don't know what your favorite term is, but then we're going to come to you about, because I understand from Betty that you're involved in a million things. Why did you get involved in Recovery for All? Why did you get engaged with this campaign? Why was it a priority? But why don't we start with Rob?
Sure. So, Stephen, thank you for the intro. And just to restate quickly, our membership is both public and private sector, but really all of our members are publicly funded. They may work for private employers in group home agencies or in nursing homes, but they're publicly funded through Medicaid tax dollars. And so we saw this very much as a political fight. That's not a new thing for our local, but particularly if we're talking about the period of time when the contracts were expiring, spring of 2021, that was after a truly horrific year in which 24 of our members died because of COVID-19. Folks were reporting to work with gowns that they had made out of trash bags. It was not lost on us that a Medicaid-funded population, meaning disproportionately Black and brown, and by definition poor, and a workforce that was also overwhelmingly Black and brown, female, and in many cases poor, was doing this work. And as they were begging for PPE to save themselves and their residents, that they were being told things by state officials, such as, there's no problem with PPE in nursing homes. If people are wearing trash bags, it's by choice. Mind you, this was taking place at the same moment that we were watching Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and George Floyd murdered. So it wasn't a far leap for our members to understand that, in the words of Gloria Duquette, one of our nursing home warriors, it was time for the governor to take his knee off our neck. And we were quite explicit in linking racial justice in our demands. I would say that was one of the key pieces, was that we were chin out and very much unapologetic in saying that it was unacceptable that Black and brown lives, the caregivers' lives, be expendable, in this moment. And so we incorporated that into our tactics and our demands at multiple levels. Number one, we engaged in multiple civil disobediences, and not the sort of scripted stuff where you call the police 3 months ahead of time. We just showed up, come down and arrest us, was the approach that we took, which I think created greater and greater tension. And we linked that, of course, explicitly to the civil rights movement and to folks being willing to create tension, create drama, and endure risk and danger in order to fight for justice. Number two, we put explicit racial demands in our contract language. So for instance, mandatory reporting of disciplines by race and gender of both the grievant and the supervisor. So that, for instance, in one particular nursing home in Danbury, where you had 60% of the workforce Latina, but 90+% of the discipline given to Latinas, okay? We said, problem, this needs to change, and we got the contract language in all of our contracts to make sure that we could deal with that. Second issue in terms of racial justice, we've, many of our members who commute from chocolate cities into vanilla towns. And of course, as they're doing that, driving while Black becomes a real issue, both in terms of the workers' rights and livelihood, but also because they start getting disciplined for being late. So we got contract language that states that if we're having those problems, and we have, that management will call for a meeting with the local police department where the union can represent workers' needs and concerns, okay, in those meetings. I believe that's the first of its kind contract language nationally. Last, in terms of explicit racial justice demands, was I believe we've won now Juneteenth in every contract as a paid holiday, including for both our public and private sector members. And so all of this was predicated, of course, on having in places where we had the right to strike, in nursing homes and group homes, strike-ready organizing committee that was, willing to push the envelope, and of course, building alliances with folks like my brother, Pastor Rodney Wade, who is, folks, I just want you to know, one of the really special fighters for racial and economic justice around the country, even though he still owes me and my partner a spades game, even though he's been ducking it. Maybe he's scared, but he'll talk about that.
So now are you a vicious spades player? I just need to know, are you one of those people that does some serious trash talking?
My girlfriend carries me.
Okay. In our family, definite tension over spades game. But one thing I just want to lift up is, and then we'll go to Pastor Rodney, is they won all those things, but they also won more economically than they ever have in the past. Because Greg, from the beginning, said, some people have this crazy idea that if you have other demands, you give up in economics. I think you took nursing home workers to $5 an hour raise to close to $20 minimums.
Yeah, we squeezed over a 2-year period about $500 million out of the state government, and took folks from 15 to 20 over the life of the contract, won pensions in a bunch of places. So real breakthroughs, but I would say that the greatest breakthrough was that it gave our membership in a time of darkness, a place to focus all of the pain and suffering that they had endured and cared for others through. And for once, get the powers that be to show up with some shred of respect and dignity.
So Pastor Rodney, they have a Recovery for All. There's a big coalition. This is all going on. Why did you get involved? What did this seem like to you? How is this different than other campaigns you've been supportive of?
First, thank you for allowing me the opportunity to be here with my brother Rob, who has done phenomenal work with the 1199. Really for me, some of the same things that Rob is pointing out, for years, being a part of coalitions who really weren't committed to going all the way, right? So who would talk about really wanting to get into the fight, but oftentimes really falling short. But I think with Recovery for All, we made a commitment from the beginning to really be centered around our values, right? Because as I often say, we all want the same thing. We all want the same thing, contrary to what others may say or not say. We all want the same things. We all want to live in robust communities. We all want to be able to take our kids to school. We all want to be able to provide for our families, and we all want to be treated decently, right? We all want that. And so as we looked at the pandemic, basically, the pandemic just exposed, the latter of all of the things that I just discussed, right? How in Rob's and them case, they're going into these nursing homes and just not being treated fairly. And then at some point, for me, it was about not just being called heroes, but understanding that they deserve more zeros, right? And so And so for us, that's what brought us into the fight, being committed to our values and making sure those who are connected to us stay to those values, because it's easy in this business to lose track of what you really believe in because you just want to win a contract, or you just want a bill to be passed. And so ultimately, and so oftentimes you end up, when it's all over, what's said and done, just feeling like shit. Y'all excuse me, I'm a cussing pastor. You feel that way because you feel like you didn't get anything. You just compromised all the way down. And so we made a commitment to hold those who would be allies for us to really be in the fight and to push for the things that we really wanted. And that meant also, if we couldn't connect with some of the larger groups just to have numbers, that was fine with us, because we were going to push our value system in this season. And so that meant, hey, if you're not willing to be out there on the front lines, taking a rest, you really don't want to be down with us, right? If that meant holding the line with our elected officials, then so be it. Calling them out, then so be it. And I think that's what Recovery for All has really provided, a landing place that is committed to actually the things that we actually believe in, really trying to create a Connecticut that we all can be proud of, and to minimize the great divide that we find in our state. Oftentimes they say it's the richest state, but we who live in this state understand that there's two Connecticut's, right? There's a Connecticut, where folk are very affluent, but then there's also this Connecticut where people are struggling day to day just to make ends meet. And we were committed to bridge that gap. And so I'm so grateful for Brother Rob and for 1199 and their commitment to the fight, because that just energized me, because finally we found the union who was really ready to fight, to really ready to go the whole way. And so that was something that I wanted to be involved with and be a part of. And so, so that's why we're here.
That was, I'm going to go to Rob real quickly because he raised his hand, and then we're going to move on. But I think what's really important to pull out is it wasn't like they got this great contract and then everybody said, we're done, we'll see you in 3 years. The Recovery for All work is ongoing. And that's another key principle of bargaining for common good, which is the fight continues even if you have a victory. It's not like we go home and then come back in 3 years. And it was fundamentally a different relationship. But Rob, go ahead, jump in, and then I'm going to move on.
Just very quickly, on the question of racial justice and how we do coalition work, most coalitions function in a way where, if somebody raises an objection, i.e., for example, hypothetically, if police unions raise an objection about the coalition maintaining racial justice work, well, then the coalition won't take that position. Right. We had a very tense internal fight where we talked to some of the unions that represent folks in criminal justice, and we said, look, if y'all aren't down with this, then you can find another place, but we're not compromising on taking a strong position in terms of police accountability. And by the way, that is a working class and labor issue. It's our members. Your members may be worried about getting sent to jail if they shoot somebody. Our members are the folks that in many cases are getting shot.
All right.
So we're not going there. And I think that was an important fight to have. We were actually able to keep our criminal justice representing unions inside the coalition without compromising our principles through the leadership of Brother Wade and others.
Absolutely.
That's fantastic. And we're going to, as people are listening, to think about questions you have, because we're hopefully going to have time after we go through the 4 campaigns to ask more questions. One other thing, I know they run one in Connecticut, I think I'm right, is that there was more money for mobile vans and social workers, so that when there's a mental health emergency, you don't send police with guns, you send social workers who know how to help people. So again, Connecticut, if you think back to the things we talked about, hit almost, I think, all of the different pieces. And now for a little bit of a different campaign, which is CWA is a Communication Workers of America, and they've really been hit hard by a variety of changes in the industry. And one of the questions here is about broadband. And so we're going to have Misty Robertson and Stan Santos talk about why they're having a campaign, why they have a campaign about broadband and how is that both around workers and communities. And then Stan is going to also talk as the rank and file person about how this plays out in real life. But go ahead, Misty, why don't you get started?
Thank you for having us today. So through the COVID pandemic, it really shined a light on the lack of broadband, especially in rural and marginalized communities in this country. And CWA believes in affordable, reliable, high-speed internet for all. So we got together and formed the Broadband Brigade, is what we're calling it. And it's made up of technicians who are union activists that lead state and regional advocacy to win high-quality broadband build-out with good union jobs. It was formed to push for CWA's priorities in the Infrastructure Act, which as a result has included a mandate for high road labor practices by companies receiving deployment grants. That the broadband industry is broken in many ways, and the providers focus only on profit and have successfully fended off regulation. This leaves so many communities without high quality fiber broadband. Telecom companies have cut our jobs and outsourced our work to subcontractors as a cost-cutting measure and a way to bust the union. This also impacts the safety and quality of the work. By exposing shoddy contractor work, we're bringing to light the cost of corporate greed. And our broadband members have spoken to so many audiences about these issues, from elected leaders to labor councils, industry groups, and community allies. Now they're actually relied upon as experts in the field and are working to reshape broadband politics on a state-by-state level.
So before we go to Stan, we again have an industry, remember Cindy Estrada started talking about the transformation of the auto industry, is that we have an industry that's going through a radical change where the employers want to put the burden on workers and simultaneously are, I think the expression was used earlier, doing digital redlining. And so CWA, it's not in this case, bargaining for common good doesn't always take place at the bargaining table. It's how we combine with community groups to leverage power in various ways. So on the one hand, they're trying to get work for their members and protect their standards. But on the other hand, they're trying to work with communities. And so Stan, tell us a little bit about how you're doing this and what you're thinking and what's working, what's easy, what's hard.
Well, excuse me. I come from the Central Valley, and although I'm a telecom technician, splicing technician specifically, I can't disassociate myself from my roots, which is predominantly immigrant community. The culture in the Central Valley is a mix of Mexicano, Guatemalteco. We've got indigenous folks who don't even speak Spanish. And, so it's rural and inner city, basically unserved. And so we see the social and economic disparities, and then it becomes more critical when they're amongst the poorest and living in some of the worst environmental conditions, poor air quality, poor water, lack of economic opportunities to lift themselves out of the farm worker economy. And our employees are cutting jobs while serving these communities with really deplorable level internet connectivity, the poorest broadband that you'll see anywhere. Broadband that we were building 20 years ago is still being built today in the Central Valley. So, we started a couple of years ago to build relationships with those communities and, spent time testing broadband speeds in low-income housing and talking to folks to learn about the demographics and how to put that on the map. Then the moment came when COVID hit, and it really brought the disparities to light, and it really brought the attention of the legislators and California agencies and public services, education, everything came into focus as far as the lack of the ability of these children and families to connect for healthcare, for online learning, and for basically just being included in the economic and the basic social needs. So the state decided to invest $6 billion in a fiber backbone. We identified gaps in that backbone that would leave the traditionally unserved communities basically off the map. And so we were able to work with those communities, several city councils and these are small city councils with populations of 6 to 10, 11,000, where, the mayor and the city council members are actually living off of a full-time job, sometimes in the ag industry, and they're getting a part-time stipend to make the decisions for their community. So they signed resolutions of support. We sent them up to the California Public Utilities Commission and the governor's office. And as a result, we were able to win a fiber network of 53 miles, which will cost multiple millions of dollars to install and which wouldn't have happened otherwise. And so that was something that I have to thank the support of those communities and our relationship that developed over time. And also, of course, the support of our national office, because we had to do a lot of critical analysis. And it's a very technical field, but we were able to bridge those, the technical issues with the political issues and build the support. But that's part of CWA's triangle, which is fundamentally bargaining and representation on the bottom, organizing on the one side, political activism also identified as movement building on the other.
Well, what I love about it, that you brought out something that's sort of been not it's explicit, but been raised. Janitors in Minneapolis having knowledge because of their job about the danger of the chemicals and everything that was talked about that other people don't have. So the union took their members' knowledge. What you're describing is CWA has this unique knowledge that most of us don't have about how this all works. And so I love the idea that you're channeling, and I know as somebody who's worked a lot with CWA that your members are incredibly proud of their work. So I love the idea that you're not just having some outside experts say what's coming in, you're taking the knowledge of your members and then you're bringing people together. And again, this is not just about, can you pick up a few jobs? This is about how these communities become fully part of this country. And the pandemic, as you said, brought home, how much did any of those kids learn when there was at-home schooling if they didn't have broadband? So it's really fantastic to think about this as a way that we both tap union members' skill, put pressure on politicians, and build out the kind of alignment that gives you the power to win. And this takes us, we're going to come back in a second, I'm going to have a round of questions. This takes us to the final campaign that we're going to talk about, and then we're going to go through a round of quick questions, which is we have, are both Amandas up? There we go. We have two Amandas, the two Amandas. We have Amanda Rabinas and we have Amanda, and I'm going to try to say your last name. I'm not sure I'm going to get it right. Condolaje? How was I? Terrible. Close? Anyway, what they're going to talk about a little is there's been this transformation. We all hear about newspapers are dying. And some people act like this is a natural course of things because of the internet. But there's something much more insidious at work here, which is we talk about exposing the bad actors, which is hedge funds have been buying up the industry, and with devastating consequences for workers and communities. And I would say farther, not to steal your thunder, devastating consequences for democracy. So why don't we go, I think we're going to Amanda R. first to hear a little bit about how CWA is approaching this, and then to the other Amanda.
Thanks, Stephen. Just in general, one of the first things I learned and the reason I got into journalism is that journalism gives voices to people who do not hold power. These are people, everyday people in the community who, quite frankly, deserve a chance to be heard because it impacts how that rules society around us. And so I just want to say we were able to get a lot of community members to show up to one of our former bargaining sessions. And it got the company rep to say afterwards, it's like you wanted to start a war. And you know what, quite frankly, this boosted our energies. This was a chance for us to say, we deserve your attention. And yeah, we may not call it a war, We call it in our unit a jock itch. We're going to be uncomfortable for you because you've made it uncomfortable for us. And therefore, there's these broader implications where we were able to bring community members to discuss. And I know Amanda Kay will go into that. But I just wanted to say, I will continue to shame Alden Capital. And because they just do not allow fair wages, there's a total disregard to senior reporters here. Only prioritizing stories that get clicks. These aren't the stories that make change. And this isn't the stories that we want to see journalists cover. And so when we had community members talk about how important it is also for them, it really reaffirmed the core values and reasons why I got into journalism. It's not easy. It takes a lot of coordination to get this done, but it's worth it when you take control of sessions and you take control of the conversations at the bargaining table with your company's reps. You get them face to face, and like I was talking in the discussion rooms, you put a mirror up and you make them just as uncomfortable as they made your working conditions. And community members, they get it. This is what they do. So to get involved and around that conversation is something that we actually realized that a lot of community members were very eager to do. And I'll let, I think, Amanda Kay go into what that all took.
Yeah, so one of our big escalation was bringing, more than a dozen community members to the bargaining table, mostly from local unions. We visited their meetings, we talked with them about what their issues were, and we talked to them about where we fit in with their fight. We connected with a ton of organizations, teachers unions, retiree groups, theme park workers, local organizations like Central Florida Jobs for Justice and Florida Rising, even a local pastor joined our fight. And we were so incredibly moved by how passionate our community was about, specifically working conditions and inequities at the Sentinel. They overwhelmingly, our community overwhelmingly said that they were with us all the way and they were willing to help out whatever we needed. And they stepped up to basically, during this meeting that Amanda R. was talking about, they basically explained to Alden representatives what equity means. And, during the meeting, the company rep said it was a surprise to them, to see everybody and they were caught off guard. So this led to a big change in tone from them, and they realized how serious we were. And, with so many community members behind us, we have a credible walkout threat now, and hopefully the company, we know the company sees that. And one of the big long-term benefits is we now have regular meetings with our community partners who are, ready to jump in and help us, just do they see themselves in our fight just the same way as journalists, we're ready to tell those stories that need to be told.
Well, what's really interesting for folks who don't know is that this company, Alden Capital, which is, I think I'm right, is just really a scumbag family, excuse my language, but maybe that's too kind. And they've been buying up newspapers, and then they basically lay people off, which destroys the delivery service. And then they aggregate news from all over the country. And so it's the destruction of not just jobs, but of journalism. And I think what's so exciting about this, what's so exciting about it is that it's about community members seeing that they're getting devastated, because how do you know what's going on in the community? But Amanda R., I was wondering, how are you thinking about, because this Alden owns lots of companies, about how you're coordinating bargaining between different cities and different parts of the country?
I am part of a joint bargaining table that includes newspapers from across the nation, Tidewater Guild, Capital Gazette, Morning Call. So we just support when, I think it was a Morning Call had a big walkout the other day. they were able to stream it live, and everyone from different news organizations watched and commented. And I have to say, organizing has gotten harder with the pandemic. We are all working from home. But what has really increased, and what's a big mechanism of power that we were able to use, is the power of social media. So we make really big social media pushes whenever we have bargaining sessions, when we have work to roll actions, which is when we put our pencils down directly at 5 p.m. when our shift ends. We tweet about it. It's to our advantage that we do have a large following as journalists, but also the community members that we're constantly talking with also have the ears of their people who are doing on the ground work every day. And so we did really big social media campaigns. And what's the benefit of coordinating all of this, weekly meetings with different news organizations, is you get a really strong support group, and you also get that support with retweets, with Facebook shares. It's great that there's a newspaper and you see it in print. It's great that there's the internet and that exists, but it's a lot of social media is where these conversations are taking place. And we were able to, become trending in our local Twitter spheres, and I think that's so important, because I know our company cares a lot about money. And so when ad company sees this type of discrepancies or kerfuffles, I know I did not say that word correctly, but when they see this type of controversy, they get a little nervous. And so if anyone is, in the ear of Randall Smith, it's the people who are making him money. And if they have something to complain, then we've done our job to really leverage the pressure to make them understand how important it is for us and our community members here. And we're not going to back down and settle for meek contract language. They absolutely should be taking us seriously. And that's what works when everyone's kind of in lockstep in different organizations.
So it's so interesting. And then I'm going to take it back in a second to all the panelists and ask some questions, and people can raise their hands on whether they want to answer. But what CWA is doing here is, one, they're opening up bargaining. I don't know if people heard, they're bringing other people to the bargaining table, because nobody understands what assholes companies can be in bargaining until they actually sit and witness it. They're trying to move to national bargaining. They're coordinating bargaining to talk about the whole sector. They're going after, and we don't have time to do it, but after one of the biggest, this giant hedge fund, who, some of us call them vulture capitalists. And so it's got all these different ingredients, and it's a fantastic campaign. And I would say, as democracy is threatened, even more important, because if people aren't reporting the news, then how do we know how we're getting screwed? But what
Yes, one thing, I think it was Variety, they called Alden Capital the Darth Vader of newsrooms. So that's just an idea of who we're dealing with.
Yeah, and they're doing, they're going after the company on many levels. So here's what I'd like to do. We have 15 minutes left in this session. And what I want to do is just throw out sort of 2.5 questions, and then just have people raise their hand if they want to do it. So one question is, and you can pick your question, or you could just pontificate as long as it's not too long, which is, one question would be is, what are lessons you learned or recommendations that you'd make to other people who want to get into bargaining for common good? What are some of the takeaways, some of the difficulties? What is something that you think people need to know that you didn't talk about? And then the other question would be, what are you doing next? Are there concrete things that are coming up? How are you building on this? So, and then if there's something that you heard from somebody else that you want to comment on, that's fine. But why don't we throw it up into whoever whoever wants to talk now. Put up your hand if you want to jump in on those questions. Go ahead, Amanda.
Just because it's fresh in our mind, we are organizing a big wage conversation around bargaining. And so I would say always be recruiting people to bargain. And just one piece of advice that really helped me, and I'll be quick, you don't have to be a lawyer to bargain. You just have to know what you go through every day, and that's it.
Very important. One of the things we do in Bargaining for Common Good, we're about democratizing the process. It's not about experts. It's about people doing the work and getting involved. But Nazir, you got your hand up, so go ahead.
Sure, yeah. I was gonna say that actually to bring up open bargaining, it was pretty powerful to attend these bargaining sessions, watching like a handful of suits, walk into a room with like 100 Black and brown janitors, union members, and people are I feel like Local 26 is the People's United Nations sometimes, because they have like 6 different languages concurrently being translated during bargaining. And yeah, and I think not only that, like what we have, building off of what happened and what we witnessed there, that was a big lesson was, I remember Greg calling me like after they had won, and like sort of surprised a little bit, I felt like, about how like concerned or how reactive the employer was to the green demands. And I think what I witnessed at the table was that like arguing for these things gave the union more moral power at the bargaining table. It wasn't just that they were, arguing on behalf of their members. And I think when it comes to the climate crisis, like it's critical, that the people who are doing the work, that are actually implementing the solutions, whether it's zero waste or, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, building efficiency, et cetera, that they are the ones who are, coming like positioned to say if these policies are working or not. And I think that's a huge issue in the climate movement, because we have a crisis of greenwashing where, for example, these downtown offices, they will talk about how great they are when it comes to climate, how they're working on, building efficient, et cetera. But when you actually talk to the workers, that is not the case. And that this work with 26 has actually inspired Teamsters 320 in Minnesota. So they have introduced green demands at the University of Minnesota, and we've built a student movement around that. And the same exact thing happened where the union leadership, which was initially hesitant, witnessed the employer freaking out about green demands, and it just, it proved that there's something there that I think is really worth pushing to strengthen other demands as well.
Anybody else want to jump in here? Why don't we do Rob, then Misty? Oh, and there's Pastor. Go ahead, Rob.
Sure thing. Just in terms of recommendations, I mean, I think the first thing to me is we just have to be willing to break rules, right? We get caught in these sort of perpetual games with elected officials where they ask for our endorsement, we prostitute ourselves for them, and then from the moment they're elected, they start backtracking on commitments that they have made to us. They play us for jokes. And our sort of little, let's show up at the Capitol and lobby, that stuff, I piss off our political people by saying, lobbying is dead. We still have to do it, but if we're not willing to create, real tension in terms of strikes, civil disobedience, and things that make things, I'm going to steal Jock Itch, by the way, from the Newspaper Guild, to make folks in places of power uncomfortable, then forget it. And I think, again, that on a certain level, that also applies to the internal coalition work. If we're about anything, there are going to be points in time where our internal unity is tested, okay? Because standing up for racial and economic justice is not a starting point for most organizations. That is work. So I think be ready to fight for principles, and not have the principles of coalitions watered down to the lowest common denominator, which is how most coalitions, let's face the facts. I mean, the AFL-CIO, SEIU, pick your organization, how most coalitions work. And then lastly, I would say, just in terms of our next fight, we are serious about getting to a real discussion about redistribution. Okay, the billionaires have partied on during the course of the pandemic, while our people have bled out and died, and are now getting hit with inflation and everything else. And so we are looking to get out of this endless cycle that we have in Connecticut, where we have this joke played upon us, where the state goes quote unquote broke, okay, without ever looking to touch the wealth of the most wealthy state per capita in the United States. So those are just a couple of things that I would lay out.
Great. Misty, and then let me know who else. Go ahead, Misty. And then we'll go to Brahim.
I was thinking about the three-pronged approach that Cindy brought up with UAW about workers, climate, and community. And what CWA is focused on going forward is we are working with state and local government elected officials to tell them, like as far as climate, why fiber is the best option when it comes to broadband delivery. Fiber is fed by light and it's future-proof, so it does not require power from electric grids. And a lot of people don't know that that means it's the actual lightest when it comes to cutting into the carbon footprint. So we're educating our elected officials on things like that, and then going to our community partnering groups, talking about, you know, the jobs that'll be created from all this funding and how women and marginalized workers are equally paid and equally looked at when it comes to granting this work. So that's some more things that we have coming up that we have to think about how we all fit together with our community partners.
I think, Brahim, did you want to?
Yeah. I want to emphasize on the open bargaining Nasser talked about. That's a big component of the success of things that we have done here in Minnesota. And I think that it should be advocates to other organizations that are learning how to, you know, take on big corporations. In addition to that, one thing that we are doing here in Minnesota is also have a shared calendar with other organizations around us. You know, not only Local 26, but how can we as a community have a shared calendar and pick moments where we can escalate or we can train ourselves, you know, like the week of action that we do, and pick fight, you know, as a community and just get it done.
Thank you. So we have time for one more person, and then I was going to wrap up. So one more comment or question. Does anybody want to jump in? I can't believe this group. Yeah, go ahead.
I missed the question because a call
So
popped in. So
The question was, what are the sort of lessons you've learned, recommendations you have for other organizations undertaking this, or what you see as next steps? It was basically a broad question that allows you to preach.
Yeah, I think one is really being committed to your values. I think that's, to me, that's the most important thing, because at every level, you're going to be asked to compromise, right? To compromise something. And so it's holding to your core values of what it is that you're trying to build and what it is you're trying to grow, and the people that you're trying to help, right? That you're trying to help. So if you stay very committed to those core values, it'll take you a long way. And it not only keeps you centered, but it keeps the people who you're working with centered as well, because everybody is clear. Number two, it really is re-educating our elected officials. I think Rob spoke to it, that, you know, this is a exchange, right? If you want my vote, then there's an expectation that you have to do something for me. You know, that this is an exchange, that we're no longer kind of in this symbolic type of thing. Come say something nice at our event, win our vote. No, at the end of the day, the only thing that matters is how you vote, is how you vote. And if you don't stand with us when we need you to stand, then you're a problem. You're not an ally, you're a problem. And so just kind of making that very clear that you're not an ally. And then I also, you know, most of us run in the Democratic circles is really, you know, asking these larger questions. Who really are the true Democrats? And if we're not willing to have those conversations around, hey, we can't just be electing folk just because, you know, they got a D at the end of their name. Because in my city alone, we got a whole bunch of Democrats, but they act like Republicans. You understand what I'm saying?
Absolutely.
So we just have to be committed to understanding who really is with us, and then hold them accountable in that way, because ultimately it benefits all of us if we do it that way. Yeah.
So I was informed by the timekeeper that I can have that Amanda Kay can jump in, that they're going to give us an extra 2 minutes. So I'm going to go to Amanda and then I'm going to sum up. But I just want to say one thing that's really coming out here, which is, I think of most coalitions as letterheads. We all sign up to support the coalition and then don't do anything we promise to do. And one of the things that I think Connecticut is pointing out is that it doesn't help to have a giant coalition if it's milquetoast and stops you from doing what you want to do. So bargaining for common good has a different approach. It's been, who are we really aligned with? Who do we really agree with on values, on analysis? And let's build out from there versus how do we get as big as possible, but don't accomplish anything. But Amanda Kay, I don't want to take up the time that we just got for you. So you go ahead.
Thank you so much. I promise I'll be fast. I just wanted to kind of jump in. You were talking about like next steps and stuff. And I wanted to talk about sort of the value of increased incremental escalation. I talked earlier about like this meeting that, made the company so uncomfortable because they saw the community support that we had. And kind of our next step is to publish an op-ed, hopefully in our own paper that will, expose even more people to what we're facing. And, we've even possibly explored the idea of going down to South Florida to where some of these billionaire hedge fund people live. And we'll see what happens, like we're going to be a real painful jock itch, as Amanda R. said.
And this idea, and then I'm going to wrap up here, is this idea is key here, that there's not like the final victory and it's all done, that we have to keep putting more and more pressure on. And then the other thing that I think that Alden Capitalist does is we also need to capture that this isn't just happening to journalists. What's happening, this is happening all over the economy. Who's buying up the housing? At the very beginning, Christina talked about, or I think Christina did, about how, about housing and tenants and how it's also getting bought up. So that this is we need to link the campaigns together by showing that these are common things that are going on. The super rich buying up industries, the super rich avoiding taxes, et cetera, et cetera. So I guess I'll be the jock itch. I want to know who's going to have the courage for the graphic and the t-shirt. That will be the creativity on this. But maybe I'll just sum up by saying this, because I think there were some real themes here. One, almost everybody, even if their campaign is not focused on environmental issues, lifted up environmental issues, especially in poor and Black and brown communities. So that's sort of something that ran through everybody. And I actually didn't know until this. That second, this breaking the rules. We will not win by doing the same old things we've already done. In Connecticut, the governor threatened to call out the National Guard if they went on strike. And the reaction of the local was bring it on. And the governor backed down. That's a moment when, I hate to say it, many union leaders would get nervous. Oh, the National Guard. So this idea of breaking the rules and confronting power, the idea that traditional lobbying doesn't work, where we just go up and they lie to us. In Connecticut, they went to the Greenwich and did these actions, body bags for workers, money bags for the rich. How do you make the super powerful uncomfortable? That then this idea of opening up bargaining so that people actually see what's going on and experience it. And I think I read that the NLRB just went for an injunction against a company that was refusing to bargain because the union brought a rabbi to the table. And I think the board's theory is the union picks the bargaining committee, not the company. That this moral question, it's something I don't hear in the labor movement as much as it used to be, that we're on the side of right. We are morally right. We are envisioning the world we want to create. We want to get one step closer to the promised land. And if we don't build that in, then we're just, I don't know what we're doing. We're just doing incrementalism that doesn't matter. And then finally, this thing that I hadn't thought about before this is workers and community members as experts, that they know more about what's happening with waste disposal. They know more about what's screwing newspapers. They know nursing home workers know more about why patients are dying. Community members know about the digital redlining, so that there's a natural connect on this when we go to the talents and the wisdom and the brilliance of everybody that we work with. So I'm going to wrap up here and just say thank you all very much. I am feeling incredibly inspired, and I sort of knew what you were going to say to some extent. But new tidbits came out, and I think this is the beginning of how we start to build out a labor community movement that's not just about where we work and where we live, but it's about transforming this country into the kind of country and then the world that we want to create. And I end with this editorial comment. I think we have like a 2-year window where we have the wind behind our back for all sorts of reasons. And we need to be willing to take greater risks and break more rules and challenge people more in this period, or we're going to look back and say, shame on us that we missed a moment when everything's aligned in our favor. So thank you all very much. And I'm handing it off to whoever I'm handing it off to here, but thank you.
Yep. Thanks, Stephen. So Stephen raised the right on point that the real experts are workers, the people who are doing those jobs. They know their own industries best. And one thing that our members say as the experts in their own lives is that they can do better work if they have breaks. So let's take a break, folks. 10-minute break. We will be back at 1:29. All right, hey, folks. Hopefully folks are all coming back on. Such a great panel and so many issues that it is forcing us to think about if we are going to be serious about taking these ideas, the 5 ideas of bargaining for the common good, and really applying them in the real world, in the real messy politics of our local communities, within our own unions, within our own community organizations. How do we actually make this happen? So we are about to dive into a set of breakout rooms so that all of you can take this conversation to the next step. And there are a few questions that we wanted to lead this discussion in the breakout rooms. You know, obviously, roll with where there's energy. I think the most important part of this section is just that people really wrestle with, if we have the will, right? If we know that this is the kind of work that we want to do, bargaining for the common good campaigns, what are we really doing in our organizations? What are the actual steps to really make this possible? That's the big question. So specifically, what questions do you still have about implementing these kind of bargaining for the common good campaigns in your context? What are the challenges that you're starting to think through? What are the opportunities that you see when you're thinking about your local context? And then are there other information or support or resources that you need to do this work? We are lucky to have a national network now, Bargaining for the Common Good, that actually can help absorb some of these needs and help make sure that people who have experience are talking to people who are doing this for the first time. So let's make sure we use that. If you're clear about things and support that you need, this is a good time to name it. And then as always, please let's make sure that there's somebody assigned in each small group that can take some notes. We will only have a little bit of reporting time at the end because we want to be respectful of everybody's time during the day. But that said, we do want to capture this in the Google Docs so that we can also do follow-up. So make sure that you have a note taker. All right, so with those questions, let's break out into some breakout rooms.
Self-deprecation. All right. Welcome back, everybody. I hope you had a really good, engaging, thoughtful conversation. We are getting pretty close to the end of our time together. And I say that to say we won't actually have a lot of time for these report outs. So if there was some like nugget, some important thing that you thought about or that you heard and you want to share, there will be two options here. One is, I think we might have time for like 2, maybe 3 comments. So if you are one of the first people to raise your hand, I will call on you. Otherwise, oh, Lisa, I like that. Otherwise, drop it in the chat and, you know, the chat is live and people will be paying attention to that. And the last thing I just want to raise is that at the end of this, Greg will talk more about it. There will be a little survey so that you all know, you all can tell us what you thought of this meeting. I mean, there's a really good retention rate here, which I think means that it was an engaging conversation. Maybe it means most people fell asleep and couldn't, log out of Zoom before they snoozed. We want to know either way. But there will be space in that survey for you to say, particularly if there was some kind of like additional information, support, resources that we can provide to help you really think about how to implement this. And we want to make sure we capture that as well. All right, Lisa's got her hand up. What did you hear in that breakout? What stood out for you? What are you taking away? What do you want to share? Oh, I think we have to unmute Lisa. I don't know who can do that. Give her talking freedom. Oh, I can do that. Are you still?
All right, can you hear me now?
Yes.
All right, so just real quickly, one of the good points that was brought up in our discussion with one of the participants is as a challenge was making this collaboration when you're trying to get all these groups together not seem so transactional. Like you go into these opportunities with certain goals that you're trying to accomplish, but making it more organic and really understanding where the other person's coming from, not just getting in and getting out, just to a means to an end for what your goal was.
That's right. Yeah, that's huge. That's a really important piece about thinking about how to set it all up in the beginning, and to be thoughtful about so that we don't run into that problem just, midway through and then we're blowing up relationships that we really need. Thank you, Lisa. Others? What felt like you still had questions? What felt really exciting? Resources you might need?
What I'm learning is that not all unions actually have the resources. So some folks are doing it without not a lot of support, not enough depth on the bench, and they're not actually putting, money into the campaign. And I think CWA has really done a good job of using our members' resources to establish strategic industry fund type campaigns that would then fund the release time, because people can do it on their own after hours and try as best they can. But when you're talking about trying to align our members' interests with public entities, with community groups, I mean, that's a whole day's work a week, sometimes 2 or 3 days to really be successful, and you can't do that. Plus, I think that at least one of our members alluded to he could use some training and help to build this map, to map out the strategies and the resources, do some research and get some support so that he can build his campaign.
Yeah, that's right, Stan. This doesn't work as a side hustle as well. That's definitely true. And there's a lot of work to be done within our membership bases as individual organizations and collectively to make it real enough to stick. So there's work that has to go into it for sure. And it's important to think about how to, carve out enough capacity to make it go. Misty.
In our group, we the big thing for us is twofold. Number one, we were like, oh, is there going to be a place that we get each other's, like each community group and union, like whoever the contact person would be. I dropped mine in the chat for anybody that would like to hook up, like through this broadband work. We've got somebody in almost every state in the country. And I was telling them we have a weekly check-in call and we do kind of a community organization shout out, like, who do you work with? And sometimes, it's like, oh yeah, I forgot about those folks. So if we could get like a list of the folks that are represented here, the community partners and unions, and then also somebody had a great point about it would be nice to have some sort of a platform where we could all kind of come together and talk when we needed to, ask questions. To Stan's point, some people just want a little bit of training. I know that somebody with UAW had a couple questions about how do you put together a nationwide campaign when you have so many different states with different rules and different types of work locations, things like that. And so if we had a platform where we could share ideas, that would be nice.
That's a great suggestion. And thank you for putting your contact information in the chat, Misty, for folks. Amanda?
So I know we're short on time, but some of the big things that we were talking about in our breakout session was, number one, make people uncomfortable. Number two, call out the bad actors. And number three, like protests and getting in people's face works. We had someone talk about how there was a politician who was not supporting them and they weren't getting behind their mission. They went to their office, they protested, and they changed their mind. So, getting in people's faces and making, folks in power uncomfortable works.
Thank you, Amanda, and lifting up some of those like core pieces of what a BCG campaign is in there. Appreciate that. We might have time for one more. Anybody? Any other gem nugget that came up or like serious question about how to do this? We can follow up. Okay, I will not belabor the question. Let me turn it over to Greg to close this out.
All right, folks, and thanks, Christina. So just a great couple of hours of discussion. Hopefully there was pieces here that got you thinking differently about the work that you're already doing or the work you could be doing. That's the purpose of this space. So we ask that everybody take a look at two things right now on the shared screen. So number one is to fill out the survey. People have been asking some specific questions about help, support, sharing of lists, other things like that. That is the purpose of this survey. So please take a couple minutes to fill out that survey. Both that'll give us some feedback on how we can do these kind of spaces better, but also particularly what you need so there can be some follow-up. Because nobody is gonna redirect the path of community and labor organizing other than those of us on this call. And so us being in coordination with each other as we all get in and push is going to be really important. So please make sure you fill out that survey. Number two is there are a set of resources that we have online. In truth, the knowledge in this room is really deep. So those connections are probably even more important. But if you are like me and you like to sift through the online archives and think about stuff in the quiet of your own home, we've got some great Bargaining for the Common Good resources online that we encourage folks to connect with. So with that, we just want to thank everybody. Christina, wonderful co-hosting with you, and all the folks who put this together and spoke on it, bringing your wisdom. This is just the beginning. We got so much more we got to fight for out there, and really excited to do it with all of you. Take care, folks.
Thanks, everyone.